In the autumn of 1891, on the flat edge of the Powder River Basin in northeastern Wyoming, a 43-year-old widower named Harlow Cayne spent the last $90 he had on a burned-out homestead that 3 previous owners had walked away from. The land was 40 acres of cracked clay and buffalo grass, scorched black across the south end from a fire no one had bothered to explain, and the town of Dellwood had been calling it cursed since 1884. But what Dellwood didn't know, what no one standing at the counter of the land office that Wednesday morning could have guessed, was that a girl named Sera Finch would arrive at that property before the first snow fell, half frozen and carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a story the town would try very hard not to believe. And they didn't know that Harlow Cayne, a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words at a time since his wife died, would be the only one in Dellwood who listened to her. This is their story, a story about what happens when the wrong people get accused of the wrong things, and about the kind of man who steps forward anyway, not because it's easy, but because he cannot find a reason to step back. Harlow Cayne stood at the land office counter while the agent reviewed the deed transfer with the slow patience of a man who believed in making people wait. The office smelled of coal dust and old coffee. A map of the basin hung crooked on the wall behind the agent's head, pencil lines marking claims long since abandoned or absorbed. The agent set down his pen. "This the Kessler parcel?" he asked. Harlow nodded. The agent looked at the paperwork, then at Harlow, then back at the paperwork. "You know what happened out there. I know what I heard." The agent tapped the deed once with his finger. 3 families tried that ground. First one left after the fire took the south pasture. Second one couldn't get a well down past the clay. Third one, he stopped himself and straightened the papers. Third one just left. Harlow slid the bills forward without answering. The agent counted them. $90. He said it the way a man says something he doesn't believe he's actually seeing. For 40 acres of burnt grass and structure. The agent allowed himself a brief look that communicated everything. He signed the transfer and passed it across. Harlow folded it once and tucked it inside his coat. Outside, Dellwood moved around him with its usual certainty. Men who owned things nodded to other men who owned things. Horses stood tied at rails. Smoke rose from the hotel chimney in a clean line, the air still enough that morning to hold it straight. A man named Gideon Pry leaned against the porch post of the feed store and watched Harlow mount his gray. "That the Kessler land?" he asked no one in particular. The man beside him answered, "Looks like Cayne's the Kessler land now." Pry laughed through his nose. "Man's got more nerve than sense." Harlow rode without answering. He had stopped explaining himself some years ago and found the silence suited him. The property lay 6 miles east of town, where the land rose slightly before flattening again into a long, empty plain. The burned section was exactly as described, a wide black scar that had grown patchy with new grass at the edges, but still showed raw ground at the center, as if the earth there hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to recover. The structure the deed called a house was a 2-room frame building, with a good roof and 3 sound walls, which Harlow considered better odds than he'd started with before. He unloaded his tools and his bedroll. He started with the 4th wall, which had bowed outward from the heat and needed resetting before winter. The work was simple and physical, the kind that required his hands and left his mind free to do what it did most days: return to the same places and find them unchanged. His wife, Elna, had died in the spring of 1888. Fever, fast and final. She had been 37. He had been 39. They had no children. He had sold the farm in Nebraska where they'd built everything they intended to grow old inside, and he had moved west without a plan, which was unlike him, and which felt, at the time, like the only honest thing he could do. He worked until the light went and built a fire in the cleared stone ring outside. He ate bread and salt pork from his pack. The wind off the plain was cold and direct, the kind of cold that didn't apologize. He fed the fire and sat with his hands around a tin cup and watched the stars take shape above the basin, one by one until the whole sky was full of them. He did not sleep for a long time. The girl arrived 17 days later. Harlow was splitting wood at the east side of the house when he heard the wheels. A hired wagon came up the track from the road and stopped 30 yards out. The driver, a boy of maybe 16, climbed down and pulled a carpet bag from the back without looking at Harlow. Then he turned and helped a young woman down from the seat. She walked toward Harlow with the careful deliberateness of someone who expected to be told to leave. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was even. She held the carpet bag in both hands in front of her. "I heard you were building out here." Harlow set down the axe. He took in the details the way a man does when he's spent years reading land and weather for signs. The coat too thin for the season, the dark circle under her left eye that was 2 weeks old and turning yellow, the way she stood with her weight slightly back, ready for the conversation to go badly. "Where from?" he asked. She paused a fraction too long. "Callan Creek. Came through Dellwood this morning." Harlow looked at the driver, who had not moved from his wagon and was studying the burned field with great interest. He looked back at the young woman. "What kind of work?" "I can cook, preserve, I can mend and haul, and I learn fast." He studied her another moment. "I can offer shelter and meals. No wage yet, not until the work's worth paying for." She nodded without hesitation. Her name was Sera Finch. She was 28 years old, though she looked younger until you noticed her eyes, which had the kind of steadiness that comes from learning not to flinch. She took the smaller room without being told it was hers, set her bag against the wall, and appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later asking what he needed first. She didn't offer more than that, and Harlow, who had spent 3 years surrounded by people asking too many questions about his intentions and his grief, found the quiet of her company easier to be around than he'd expected. The days built on each other. Harlow finished the wall and started on the fencing. Sera cooked and kept the larder organized and pulled deadwood from the burned section to feed the stove. She was careful with the firewood, stacking it precisely against the south side of the house where the wall offered some shelter from the wind. In the evenings, she sat at the kitchen table and mended whatever needed mending. Harlow sat nearby and read or worked on the books he kept for the property. They spoke when there was something to say. The silence between them was not unfriendly. He noticed things he didn't ask about. She startled at doors opening. She never stood with her back to a window. When she heard horses on the road, she went still in the particular way of someone who had learned to assess sound before moving. He asked once if she wanted tea. She looked up from her mending and said, "Yes, please." And the please was polite and careful in the way of someone who had been taught that politeness was a kind of armor. He didn't ask what she was running from. It wasn't his business, and it wasn't the right question. The right question was whether she was safe where she was, and the answer to that one seemed, so far, to be yes. 3 weeks after she arrived, a man rode up the track on a bay horse. He was well dressed in the way that announced itself. Polished boots, a good coat, a hat that fit properly. He dismounted without tying the horse, which meant he didn't plan to stay long or didn't think he needed to observe the customs of approaching a man's property. His name, Harlow would learn later, was Clifton Voss. He stopped 10 feet from where Harlow was replacing fence posts and looked past him toward the house. "Sera Finch here?" he asked. His tone suggested she was an object he had misplaced. Harlow straightened. He set the post driver down deliberately. "Who's asking?" Her employer. Was her employer. He corrected himself the way people correct themselves when they're establishing a legal position. She left without notice. That's a breach of contract. Harlow looked at him for a long moment. He studied the hands, the set of the jaw, the particular kind of ease that comes from never being refused. He had seen men like this before. Men who confused ownership of land and ledgers with ownership of people. "She works here now," Harlow said. Clifton's expression shifted just slightly. "Is that so?" "It is." There was a beat of silence in which something was decided. though neither man said it aloud. "You might want to ask around about her history before you get too comfortable with that arrangement," Clifton said. His voice had dropped into something smooth and rehearsed. "She's got a habit of taking things that don't belong to her." He paused, and of lying about why. Harlow looked at him steadily. "I appreciate your coming out," he said. "The road back to Dellwood's where you came from." Clifton held his gaze another moment, then mounted and rode back the way he had come. Harlow watched until the bay cleared the first rise, then picked up the post driver and went back to work. He didn't mention the visit to Sera, but he noticed, at supper that evening, that she ate less than usual and kept her eyes toward the window. He set down his bread. Clifton Voss came by today. Her hands went still on the table. She looked at him directly for the first time since the food was served. "What did he say?" "That you took something and lied about it." She held his gaze. "Did you believe him?" "No," Harlow said. She looked back at her plate. "He runs the Voss house over on the Callan Creek Road. I was a housekeeper there for 2 years. He decided I had stolen money from the household accounts." She said it plainly, without heat. "I hadn't. But he said I had, and he said it to enough people that it didn't matter whether it was true." "What was the real reason he wanted you gone?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I told his wife what I saw," she said. "Because that was the only honest thing I could do." Harlow was quiet for a moment too. He refilled his coffee. "Yours?" He held up the pot. She pushed her cup toward him. "Please." After supper, he sat outside in the cold and thought about what was coming. Because men like Clifton Voss didn't ride 6 miles to a burned homestead for a conversation. They came to establish that they could, and to see what happened when they did. The whispers reached Dellwood before the week was out. Harlow went to town for supplies on Thursday and felt it before he heard it. The particular quality of attention in a room that means you're the subject of a conversation that stopped when you walked in. The man at the dry goods counter was civil but brief. The woman at the post window didn't meet his eye. 2 men outside the feed store found something interesting to look at across the street. He bought what he needed and rode back. Sera was at the garden patch. She'd started at the north end of the property, working the clay with a long-handled fork. She looked up when he came in. "Dellwood's heard," he said. She set down the fork. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they expected something and are relieved to have it confirmed rather than guessing at it. "What did they hear?" He gave it to her straight. "That you stole from the Voss house. That you're not to be trusted." He paused. "And that I'm a fool for taking you in." She was quiet for a moment. There was no surprise in her face, only the careful blankness of someone who had been through this before, and knew that emotion didn't help. "I can leave," she said. "It would make your life easier." Harlow looked at her. Then he looked at the garden patch, the black soil turned up in neat rows, the small stakes she'd set at the corners with string running between them. "No," he said. She looked at him. "A man named Oliver Prentice owns a cattle operation 12 miles north," he said. "His wife's name is Ruth. I worked for Oliver 3 seasons before I got this land. They're decent people. I'd like to take you there tomorrow if you're willing." She waited, unsure of the shape of what was coming. "Clifton Voss worked a land deal with Oliver 2 years ago," Harlow continued. "Oliver told me afterward that the books Voss presented weren't right. That numbers had been moved. Oliver didn't pursue it because Voss threatened to call in a note he was holding. But he remembers it. I don't know if that helps you. But I'd like to try." She studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the buffalo grass at the edge of the property, and the sky to the west was going bronze with the late afternoon. "All right," she said. They rode out, the next morning before the frost had lifted from the ground. Ruth Prentice met them at the door and showed them into a warm kitchen that smelled of biscuits and wood smoke. Oliver was a broad, deliberate man in his 60s who shook hands once and meant it. Harlow explained what he needed. Oliver listened without interruption. When it was done, Oliver looked at Sera for a long moment. "You kept the Voss accounts?" he asked. "Yes, sir. For most of the second year." Oliver turned to his wife. "Ruth, Would you get the box from the office shelf? The one with the Voss correspondence. Ruth returned with a wooden box. Oliver opened it and spread papers on the table. He and Sera bent over them together, and Harlow stood back and let them work. An hour later, 3 things were clear. First, the Voss household accounts had been adjusted. Not by Sera, whose handwriting appeared in the original entries, but in a second hand that had been added later over correction fluid. Second, Clifton Voss had paid 2 of Dellwood's most prominent citizens, a lawyer named Chester Haig, and the editor of the Dellwood Courier, for services rendered in the same months the accounts had been altered. Third, Oliver Prentice was angry in the quiet, complete way of a man who has been careful his whole life and does not appreciate having his patience exploited. "I'll come to town with you," Oliver said. He didn't ask. He stated it. Ruth looked at Harlow. "You'd better take her to see Judge Warwick before Voss does." They rode into Dellwood the following morning, 4 of them. Harlow, Sera, Oliver, and Ruth, who had decided on her own that she was coming, and had said so in a tone that closed the subject. The Prentice name carried weight in that county. The judge who came to his office door at 9 in the morning to find Oliver Prentice on his step listened very carefully. Sera laid out the facts without embellishment. She was steady and precise. When she was finished, Oliver set the papers from the box on the judge's desk and waited. The judge read for a long time. He looked up at Sera. "You never took anything from the Voss house," he said. "It was not a question." "No, sir," she said. "I took my wages, my possessions, and the truth about what I saw. Nothing else." The judge nodded slowly. He was a man who had been on the bench long enough to recognize the particular texture of a fabricated accusation when it was set beside the real thing. He sent for Clifton Voss the next morning. What happened in that courthouse, in the days that followed, was not dramatic, in the way that moments of justice sometimes pretend to be. There was no shouting, no grand declaration. Chester Haig. When the altered accounts were placed in front of him, and he was told that Oliver Prentice had endorsed the findings, took a very long time to say anything, and then said everything. The Courier editor, a small man named Wren Tuttle, provided a written statement that took the better part of 4 pages, and implicated Clifton Voss in the management of 3 other accusations that had been used to remove inconvenient people from inconvenient positions. Clifton Voss hired the best lawyer available in the county, and found that the best lawyer available in the county was Chester Haig, who was no longer available. The charges were formal and specific: fraud, defamation with financial motive, misuse of written record. The judge set a hearing date and made clear that the matter would not be deferred. Harlow stood outside the courthouse in the pale November sunlight and watched the street absorb what had happened. It moved slowly. Towns do. Word travels faster than understanding, and understanding travels faster than the willingness to change a long-held opinion. But it moved. Oliver came out and stood beside him. "She holed up in there?" he asked, nodding back toward the building. "Held up better than most," Harlow said. Oliver looked at him. "You've done a decent thing." Harlow said nothing. He had not done it to be decent. He had done it because a person had told him the truth. And the truth had been clear, and he could not think of a reasonable argument for looking away from something clear. Sera came out a moment later with Ruth at her side. She stood in the sunlight and took a breath, the slow kind, the kind that means the air has changed. She looked at Harlow. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "You did the work." She looked at the street, at the people who had heard and were deciding what to do with what they'd heard. A woman from the millinery stopped and held her eye for a moment, then nodded. A man from the hardware store crossed the street and spoke to Oliver. 2 boys on horseback slowed without stopping. The town was reconsidering, quietly, imperfectly, the way towns do, without apology, without formal acknowledgement that it had been wrong, simply by beginning to be different. They drove back to the property in the late afternoon. The sky behind them, going dark, rose above the basin. Sera sat on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap. Her carpetbag was in the back where it had been on every trip, Old habit. He noticed she didn't look at it. She saw him notice. Old reflex, she said. I got used to being ready to go. Harlow kept his eyes on the track. You don't have to be anymore, he said. Not from here. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you see in those first days when I arrived? You didn't ask. You just gave me the room and waited. He thought about it honestly. He saw a person who was telling the truth and had stopped expecting to be believed. He said, That's usually enough. She looked at him for a long time after that. He kept his eyes on the track, but he was aware of her gaze the way you are aware of warmth when you've been cold for a long time. Winter came down properly over the next weeks. The burned field at the south end stayed bare, but everything else held. Sera's garden was under straw and sleeping, waiting for spring. The house had good heat now, the fourth wall solid, the gaps chinked and sealed. One evening in December, when the snow had come and the basin was quiet under it, Harlow was working at the table on the deed records for a fence easement when Sera set a cup of coffee beside him without being asked. He looked up. She said, I want to stay on past winter. I want to work this land properly if you'll have me. He looked at her directly. This was not a small thing she was saying. He understood that. I'd want you to have a wage, he said. Real wages, kept separate and yours. She nodded. That's fair. He turned back to the paperwork. Then, spring comes early some years out here. March, sometimes. The garden plot you've started will need expanding if we're putting in a real kitchen garden. She sat down across from him and pulled the map of the property toward her. I was thinking the same thing, she said. If we cleared the east edge of the burned section, the ash would help the soil. They bent over the map together. Outside, snow moved against the windows. The stove held its heat. The lamp made a small, steady circle of light over the table. And in that circle, two people who had each lost something real sat planning what might grow from ground that other people had given up on. By spring, the burned section was cleared and turned. Sera planted it in sections. Kitchen crops closest to the house, then oats on the south end where the ash ran deep. Harlow fenced the perimeter and built a proper gate at the road, the kind with a crossbar and hinges that swung level. A man named Abel Comstock from 2 miles east stopped one morning to look at the fencing. Hadn't been a working gate there in 6 years, he said. Sera handed him a coffee through the window. That was before, she said. Abel Comstock took the coffee and looked around at the property, the garden, the cleared field, the straight fence lines. He looked at Harlow, who was setting posts at the east corner. Then he looked at Sera, he said. The Voss business, I should have listened better. Earlier. Sera looked at him evenly. Yes, she said, but you can listen well now. That counts for something. Abel nodded and finished his coffee and went on his way. There were others. Not all of them stopped. Not all of them said anything. Some simply slowed their horses as they passed and let their eyes move across what the land had become. And the looking was its own kind of acknowledgement. The hearing came in April. Clifton Voss was found to have committed fraud in 3 documented cases over 7 years. With Sera's situation, the most recent and the most thoroughly documented. He paid restitution, surrendered his claims on 2 properties, and left the county before summer. Chester Haig resigned from practice. Wren Tuttle closed the Courier, which was perhaps the most tangible sign to Dellwood's residents that something had genuinely shifted since the paper had run the community's official version of events for 11 years. Harlow was not there for the verdict. He was at the property, driving the last of the summer fence posts. Sera came back from town with Oliver and Ruth in the late afternoon and walked straight to where he was working. He looked up, she said. It's done. He set down the hammer and looked at her face, which was doing something careful and held, the particular expression of someone trying to decide how much relief they're allowed to show. He said, You all right? She let out a breath. The careful expression broke open a little. Yes, she said. I think I actually am. He picked up the hammer again. He looked at the post line, extending down the south end of the cleared field, straight and true. Then he looked at her. Help me with the last 3? he asked. She found the second hammer where he'd left it on the fence rail and walked down to the next post, without answering, which was her way of saying yes. They worked until the light left the basin, and the first stars appeared over the plain. The soil there, where the fire had run through it years ago, was dark and deep and good, the kind of ground that had been through something and come out richer for it. The fence posts went in clean. When the last one was set, they stood and looked out across what the land had become. The garden was coming in thick. The burned section was planted. The gate at the road hung level. Sera said, quietly, "I kept waiting for you to ask me to leave. Every time something went wrong." He looked at her. "I don't ask people to leave when things go wrong," he said. "That's when you need to stay." She looked at him for a moment. The same long look she had given him that evening by the lamp and the map. Then she looked back at the land. The wind moved through the new grass on the south pasture, soft and persistent, the way wind is when the season has finally shifted and the cold is done. What is built on scorched ground, when it is built with care, does not need the world's permission to stand.